1892. Couple's portrait recovered, and the researchers whisper as they zoom in on the bracelet. Marcus had been avoiding his grandmother's attic for 3 weeks since her funeral. The Charleston humidity made the cramped space feel like an oven, and every box he opened released decades of accumulated dust that made him sneeze. But his mother had been insistent. Someone needed to sort through everything before they sold the house. He pulled another cardboard box toward him, this one labeled simply "Old Pictures" in his grandmother's shaky handwriting. Inside, wrapped in yellowed newspaper from 1965, he found a collection of photographs in various states of preservation. Most were from the 1940s and 50s, his grandmother as a young woman, his grandfather in his military uniform, family gatherings he'd heard about but never seen. Then, at the bottom of the box, in a separate envelope marked "Do Not Discard," he found it. The photograph was older than the others, clearly from a different era entirely. The formal studio portrait showed a well-dressed African-American couple seated against an elaborate backdrop. The man wore a dark suit with a crisp white shirt, his posture dignified and confident. The woman beside him wore an elegant dark dress with intricate lace details at the collar and cuffs, her hair styled in the fashion of the late 1800s. But what caught Marcus's attention immediately was how prosperous they looked. This wasn't a simple portrait. The clothing, the studio setting, the couple's bearing all spoke of wealth and status that seemed impossible for Black Americans in that era. Marcus turned the photograph over, written in faded ink, "Samuel and Grace, Charleston, 1892. He pulled out his phone and took a picture, texting it to his mother. "Do you know who these people are?" Her response came quickly. "Your great-great-great-grandparents. Grandmother told me about them once. Said they were important, but she never explained why. She always said someone needed to find out their story properly." Marcus studied the photograph again. The couple stared directly at the camera with expressions that weren't quite smiling but held something else. Determination, perhaps, or defiance. They looked like people who had fought for something and won. He noticed the woman, Grace, wore a bracelet on her left wrist. It seemed oddly plain compared to her elegant dress, just a simple metal band. Something about it nagged at him, but in the dim attic light, he couldn't quite make out the details. Marcus carefully placed the photograph back in its envelope and climbed down from the attic. His grandmother had said someone needed to find out their story properly. He decided that someone would be him. The next morning, he took the photograph to the Avery Research Center for African American History and Culture, hoping someone there could help him understand who Samuel and Grace really were. Dr. Patricia Williams had worked at the Avery Research Center for 15 years, and she'd seen countless family photographs brought in by people searching for their history. But something about the 1892 portrait Marcus showed her made her pause. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the photograph. Marcus handed it to her carefully. Patricia carried it to her desk and pulled out a high-powered magnifying glass and a specialized lamp. She examined the image methodically, starting with the studio backdrop, then the couple's clothing, looking for any identifying details. "The studio mark is partially visible here," she said, pointing to a faint embossing at the bottom corner. "J. Stevens, Charleston. He was one of the few photographers who would photograph Black clients in the 1890s. That alone tells us your ancestors had means. Studio portraits weren't cheap." She moved the magnifying glass across the image, studying the couple's faces, their posture, the details of their clothing. Then she stopped, her hand hovering over Grace's wrist. "Marcus, do you have a digital camera or a good phone camera?" "Yes, why?" "I want to see this bracelet in higher resolution. There's something... Can you photograph just this section?" Marcus pulled out his phone and carefully photographed the area Patricia indicated. She connected his phone to her computer and pulled up the image, zooming in progressively until the bracelet filled the screen. They both fell silent. The bracelet wasn't plain at all. Covering its surface were tiny symbols, marks that at first glance might have seemed like decorative etching, but under magnification revealed themselves to be deliberate, precise engravings. Small stars, circles with dots, simple house shapes, what looked like trees, and geometric patterns that seemed to follow some kind of sequence. "These aren't decorative," Patricia whispered. She zoomed in further. "These are symbols, a code of some kind." Marcus leaned closer to the screen. "A code for what?" Patricia sat back in her chair, her expression shifting from curiosity to something more intense, recognition mixed with disbelief. "I need to check something. Wait here." She disappeared into the archive's back room and returned 5 minutes later carrying a worn leather journal and several reference books. She opened one of the books to a marked page showing documented symbols used by the Underground Railroad. Marcus watched as she compared the symbols in the book to the markings on the bracelet in the photograph. Several matched exactly. "Oh my God," Patricia said quietly. "Marcus, I think your great-great-great-grandmother was wearing a map." "A map to what?" "Safe houses. Routes. The Underground Railroad used symbols like these to mark paths to freedom. But I've never seen them on jewelry before. Usually they were quilts, fence posts, marks on trees." She looked up at him. "If I'm right, this bracelet was a portable guide. Someone could carry the information hidden in plain sight." Marcus stared at the enlarged image on the screen. Those tiny symbols his ancestor had worn in a formal portrait weren't decoration. They were directions to freedom, preserved in metal, worn openly in 1892, 27 years after slavery ended. "Why would she still be wearing it in 1892? He asked. "The war ended in 1865. Patricia's expression grew serious. "That's what we need to find out. Because if she was wearing this openly in a photograph, she was trying to preserve something. Or maybe," she paused, "warn someone." Patricia scheduled Marcus to return the following morning. She spent that evening pulling every reference she could find about Charleston's black community in the 1890s, the Underground Railroad routes through South Carolina, and documented uses of coded symbols. When Marcus arrived, her desk was covered with books, printouts, and photocopies of historical documents. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted. "I kept thinking about that bracelet. I reached out to a colleague at the Smithsonian who specializes in Underground Railroad artifacts. She's never heard of symbols preserved on jewelry like this." "So it's unique?" "Possibly. Or possibly it's just the only one that survived in a photograph." Patricia pulled up the enhanced image of the bracelet on her computer. "I spent last night decoding what I could. Look at this." She'd created a document matching each symbol on the bracelet to known Underground Railroad markers. A star typically meant, "Follow the North Star." A circle with a dot meant, "Safe house here." The simple house shapes indicated specific types of refuge, some for overnight stays, others for longer periods. Tree symbols marked natural landmarks. "There are at least 15 distinct symbols on this bracelet," Patricia explained. "If each one represents a location or instruction, this could map an entire escape route." Marcus studied the screen. "But from where to where? That's what we need to figure out. The symbols follow a sequence. See how they're arranged in a line around the bracelet? Someone could read them in order, following the route step by step." Patricia opened a historical map of South Carolina from the 1850s and 1860s. Most Underground Railroad routes in this region ran from the Deep South up through the Carolinas into Virginia, and eventually to free states. Charleston was a major port city with a large enslaved population. There would have been multiple routes originating here. She pointed to various locations on the map. Known safe houses, documented in memoirs and records after the war. "Look, here, and here. If we can match the symbols to actual locations." Marcus watched as she began plotting points on the map, comparing the sequence of symbols on the bracelet to documented safe houses and known routes. A pattern began to emerge, a pathway leading north from Charleston through rural areas, avoiding major roads, following rivers and natural coverage. "This is incredible," Marcus breathed. "Someone created a wearable map." "Not just someone," Patricia corrected. "Your great-great-great-grandmother was either carrying this for someone else or—" She paused, looking up at him. "She made the journey herself." The implications hit Marcus hard. Grace, wearing that elegant dress in 1892, photographed in a professional studio, looking prosperous and dignified. She might have once been a fugitive, following those exact symbols to freedom. "How do we find out?" he asked. Patricia turned to her computer. "We start with records. Birth records, property records, church registries. We need to find out who Samuel and Grace were, where they came from, and how they went from potentially being enslaved to prosperous enough for a studio portrait." She opened the South Carolina Digital Archives. "What year did your grandmother say this was taken?" 1892. That's what was written on the back." Patricia began searching. "Let's start with the 1890 census, then work backward." The 1890 census presented an immediate problem. Most of it had been destroyed in a fire. But Patricia knew the archives well, and she found alternative records, city directories, church registries, property tax records. "Here," she said after an hour of searching. "Samuel and Grace, listed in the 1892 Charleston City Directory. Occupation, Samuel, carpenter and furniture maker. Grace, seamstress. Address, 47 Cumming Street." Marcus leaned over her shoulder. "Cumming Street? That's still there. I know that neighborhood." It was a predominantly black neighborhood then, too, one of the areas where freed people settled after the war. Patricia switched to property records. "Let's see if they owned that property or rented." The property records showed something surprising. Samuel and Grace had purchased the Cumming Street property in 1868, just 3 years after the war ended. That's fast, Patricia noted. To go from potentially enslaved to property owners in 3 years? That's remarkable, even for the Reconstruction period when some freed people managed to acquire land. She searched backward through the records. Charleston had meticulous documentation, even during the war years. She found marriage records. Samuel and Grace had married in 1866 at the African Methodist Episcopal Church on Calhoun Street. That church was a center for the freed community, Patricia explained. It provided education, support, helped people navigate their new freedom. Marcus watched as she continued searching. Can you find anything before 1866? Birth records? Slavery records? Patricia's expression grew somber. Slavery records are complicated. Enslaved people weren't systematically documented like free citizens. We have some plantation records, bills of sale, estate inventories where enslaved people were listed as property. It's dehumanizing to read, but it's sometimes the only trace people left. She opened a different database, one compiled from plantation records and estate documents across South Carolina. She searched for anyone named Samuel or Grace in the Charleston area in the years before 1865. After 20 minutes, she found an entry that made her stop. Marcus, look at this. Estate inventory from the Rutledge plantation, dated 1863, listed among the property being sold after the owner's death. She pointed to a line in the faded document. One female, Grace, age approximately 19, skilled in sewing and domestic work. One male, Samuel, age approximately 21, trained in carpentry. The room felt suddenly colder. Those brief clinical descriptions reduced to property, to market value. These were almost certainly his ancestors. Patricia continued searching and found more. Here's a bill of sale from 1864. Both Samuel and Grace were sold to a Charleston merchant named Howard Blackwell. Probably needed domestic workers and a carpenter for his city residence. So they were here in Charleston, Marcus said. When did slavery end in the city? Union forces occupied Charleston in February 1865. Many enslaved people were freed when their enslavers fled or when Union troops arrived. But, Patricia pulled up another document. Some people didn't wait for the Union Army. She showed Marcus a record from the Freedmen's Bureau, established after the war to help formerly enslaved people. In their registration records from 1865, she found Samuel and Grace listed, but with a notation that caught both their attention. Self-emancipated, 1864. They escaped, Marcus whispered. They didn't wait to be freed. They ran. Patricia knew that finding details about specific escape attempts was nearly impossible. People who successfully fled didn't document their routes for obvious reasons, but she had an idea. The Freedmen's Bureau records sometimes include testimonies, she explained. When formerly enslaved people registered after the war, some gave statements about their experiences. Let me check if Samuel or Grace said anything. She navigated through digital archives until she found the Charleston Freedmen's Bureau collection. The handwriting was cramped and difficult to read, but she'd had years of practice. Here, she said, her voice rising with excitement. Statement given by Samuel, April 1865 when registering with the Bureau. She read aloud, My wife Grace and I fled the Blackwell residence in November 1864. We had learned that Mr. Blackwell intended to sell us separately, me to a plantation owner in Georgia, Grace to a family moving to Alabama. We would have been separated. We chose to risk everything rather than lose each other. Marcus felt his throat tighten. His ancestors had faced being torn apart and had chosen to run instead. Patricia continued reading. We followed a route that had been whispered about among the community. Grace had learned it from an older woman who had helped others before. She taught Grace symbols and signs that would guide us. Grace memorized them all, and when we ran, she knew every step of the way. Grace knew the route, Marcus said. She was the navigator. Patricia nodded. It makes sense. Women were often the ones who preserved and passed along information in enslaved communities. They worked in houses, heard conversations, had more freedom of movement sometimes. And skills like sewing, she paused, looking at the photograph of Grace wearing that bracelet, gave them access to tools and materials. You think she made the bracelet herself? I think it's very possible. She was listed as a skilled seamstress. She would have had access to metal findings, clasps, small tools. And if she memorized the root symbols, Patricia zoomed in on the bracelet again. She could have engraved them, creating a permanent record of the path that saved her life. Marcus stared at the tiny symbols. Each one represented a piece of knowledge that had meant the difference between freedom and continued bondage, between staying together and being separated forever. The statement mentions November 1864, he said. That's winter. They escaped in winter? Patricia pulled up historical weather records. November 1864 was particularly cold. There are diary entries from Charleston residents complaining about unusual frost. She looked at him seriously. They traveled in the cold, in the dark, following symbols Grace had memorized. No money, no resources, hunted by people who considered them property. She found another document, a newspaper clipping from December 1864. Look at this. Reward offered for return of 2 runaways. Negro man Samuel, approximately 22 years, trained carpenter. Negro woman Grace, approximately 20 years, seamstress, fled from Howard Blackwell residence. $200 reward for their capture and return. $200. A fortune in 1864. Professional slave catchers would have been searching for them. How did they survive? Marcus asked. Patricia returned to the Freedmen's Bureau statement. Samuel's account continued. The journey took 17 days. We traveled only at night, sleeping hidden during daylight. Grace's symbols guided us to safe houses, people who risked everything to help us. Quakers, free black families, others whose names I never knew. Each house gave us food, a place to rest, directions to the next haven. Without those people, we would have died or been captured. Patricia and Marcus spent the next week reconstructing Samuel and Grace's journey. Using the symbols on the bracelet, Samuel's testimony, and historical records of known Underground Railroad safe houses in South Carolina, they began mapping the route. The first symbol, Patricia explained, pointing to the enhanced image, is a simple house with a chimney on the left side. According to documented codes, a chimney on the left meant safe house, approach from the east. That matches a known safe house that existed in Charleston, a free black family named the Westons who lived on the east side of the city. She marked it on a modern map, then overlaid a historical map from the 1860s. Here, the Weston family property. Samuel's testimony mentions a family of free people of color who sheltered us the first night. That has to be them. The second symbol was a star above a wavy line. Water crossing under the North Star, Patricia translated. There's a river north of Charleston. She traced it on the map. The Cooper River. They would have had to cross it to continue north. Symbol by symbol, they reconstructed the journey. A tree with 3 branches marked a specific landmark, a massive oak that still stood in rural Berkeley County, documented in multiple historical accounts. A circle with 2 dots indicated a Quaker meeting house that had been known for helping fugitives. A square with a cross marked a specific church with an abolitionist minister. Marcus photographed each location, creating a visual timeline of his ancestors' escape. Some of the places still existed, the ancient oak now protected as a historical landmark, the church rebuilt but on the same foundation. Others had vanished, marked only by historical plaques or empty fields where buildings once stood. 17 days, Marcus said, staring at the map showing a route of nearly 200 miles. They covered almost 12 miles a day, walking only at night, in November cold. Patricia had found weather records from that period. Temperatures dropped to near freezing several nights. There are diary entries from plantation owners complaining about frost damage to late crops. She looked at the map. Samuel and Grace would have been crossing rivers, walking through swamps, hiding in forests during the day, all while slave catchers were actively searching for them. She pulled up another document, a letter from Howard Blackwell to a slave-catching firm, dated December 1864. I am willing to pay an additional sum beyond the advertised reward for the return of my property. The woman Grace possesses valuable skills, and the man Samuel is trained in fine carpentry. Their continued absence represents significant financial loss. He was still looking for them in December, Marcus noted, a month after they escaped. Slave catchers worked well into Union-occupied territories, Patricia explained. Even after Charleston fell to Union forces in February 1865, some fugitives were still being captured and returned under various legal pretenses. Samuel and Grace weren't truly safe until they reached. She traced the route to its terminus on the map, here. The final symbols on the bracelet led to a location in North Carolina, near the Virginia border, a documented terminus of one of the Underground Railroad's southern routes. There was a community there, Patricia said, pulling up historical records. Free black landowners who had purchased property before the war. They took in fugitives, helped them establish new lives. Some stayed there, others continued north to Union states or Canada. But Samuel and Grace didn't stay, Marcus said. They came back to Charleston. After the war ended, yes, many freed people returned to the places they'd escaped from. to find family members, to reclaim their lives in places they considered home. Patricia showed him the property records again. They purchased land on Cumming Street in 1868, 3 years to save enough money to buy property. That speaks to incredible determination. Marcus looked at the photograph of Samuel and Grace, taken 27 years after their escape. They weren't just prosperous. They were making a statement, sitting for a formal portrait, wearing fine clothes, in the very city they'd once fled as hunted fugitives. And Grace was wearing the bracelet that had saved their lives. Patricia found a disturbing pattern as she researched Charleston in the 1890s. The brief period of relative freedom and opportunity that had existed during Reconstruction was ending. "Look at these," she said, showing Marcus newspaper clippings from 1890-1892. New laws being passed, restricting where black citizens could live, work, vote. The beginning of Jim Crow. One article from 1891 described new ordinances, separate facilities for colored and white residents, restrictions on property ownership in certain districts, new voter registration requirements designed to disenfranchise. Another from 1892, the same year as Samuel and Grace's photograph, reported increasing incidents of violence against prosperous colored business owners. Several families have chosen to relocate north rather than face continued harassment. Marcus read the articles with growing understanding. They were losing their freedom again. Not slavery, but not freedom either, Patricia finished. The gains of Reconstruction were being systematically dismantled. Successful black families were particularly targeted. Their prosperity challenged the racial hierarchy white supremacists wanted to reestablish. She found property records showing a troubling trend. Multiple black-owned properties on Cumming Street and surrounding areas being sold between 1890 and 1895, often at significant losses. City records documented building code violations, selectively enforced against black property owners. Tax assessments that mysteriously increased on black-owned properties while decreasing on white-owned ones nearby. It was economic warfare, Patricia explained, making it impossible for black families to maintain what they'd built. She found a church registry from the AME church Samuel and Grace had attended. The pastor's notes from 1891 mentioned many of our congregation facing increasing hardship. Several families have made the difficult decision to migrate north. We pray for those who stay and those who go. Marcus thought about the photograph. Why did they take this portrait in 1892, right in the middle of all this? Patricia had been wondering the same thing. She searched for more information about J. Stevens, the photographer whose mark appeared on the image. She found an advertisement he'd placed in a black newspaper in 1892. Document your family. Preserve your heritage. These times demand we remember who we are. The photograph wasn't just a portrait, Patricia said softly. It was an act of preservation, of defiance even. They were documenting themselves, their success, their dignity, at a time when all of that was under attack. And the bracelet, Marcus added. She wore it deliberately. She wanted it in the photograph. Patricia zoomed in on Grace's face in the image. Unlike many portrait subjects of that era who looked uncomfortable or stiff, Grace's expression held something else, a direct, unflinching gaze at the camera. She knew what she was doing, Patricia said. This wasn't vanity or casual documentation. She was preserving evidence. The bracelet, the symbols, the route that saved them, she was making sure it wasn't forgotten. Marcus found more family records his grandmother had kept. Letters between family members, documents passed down through generations. One letter, from Grace to her daughter in 1910, mentioned, "I kept that bracelet all these years because I never wanted to forget the price of freedom or how easily it can be threatened. Now I give it to you. Remember where we came from. Remember what we survived." Patricia discovered something that changed their understanding of the entire photograph. While researching J. Stevens, the photographer, she found he'd been more than just a commercial portrait artist. "Look at this," she said, showing Marcus an article from an African-American newspaper published in Philadelphia in 1893. Stevens had a second purpose for his photography business. The article described how Stevens documented successful black families and businesses throughout the South, then sent copies of the photographs to northern newspapers and organizations. Proving to the nation, the article read, that colored citizens are building prosperous communities despite ongoing oppression. Patricia found correspondence in the archives, letters between Stevens and Frederick Douglass, between Stevens and various abolitionist organizations that had remained active after the war. They were creating a visual record of black achievement, countering the degrading stereotypes being promoted to justify segregation and disenfranchisement. Samuel and Grace weren't just taking a personal portrait, Marcus realized. They were participating in a documentation project. Exactly. And Grace chose to wear that bracelet deliberately. Patricia pulled up the photograph again. She could have worn any jewelry, something that showed their prosperity, their status. But she wore this, the symbol of their escape, their survival, their resistance. She found something else, a catalog from 1893, published by a civil rights organization titled The Progress of a Race. It contained dozens of photographs, including one that made Marcus's heart skip. There they were, Samuel and Grace, their portrait reproduced in print, with a caption, Mr. and Mrs. Samuel, Charleston, South Carolina, successful business owners, formerly enslaved, represent the determination and capability of the colored race. Their photograph was published, Marcus breathed. It was distributed, seen by people across the country. As evidence, Patricia said, evidence that Black Americans were building lives, creating businesses, succeeding, despite everything designed to prevent it. She showed him more photographs from the catalog. Teachers, doctors, business owners, families, all formerly enslaved, all photographed with their achievements on display. It was a visual argument against the lies being told to justify Jim Crow. But the bracelet, Marcus said, did anyone notice it? Did anyone understand what they were seeing? Patricia had found something that suggested yes. A letter written in 1894 by a Quaker woman in Pennsylvania to her sister mentioned seeing the catalog. One photograph particularly moved me. A woman wearing what I believe to be a bracelet, encoded with the symbols our network once used. I wept to see it. We helped so many reach freedom, and now to see one of those souls prosperous and proud, preserving the memory of that journey. It reminds me our work mattered. The woman didn't identify which photograph she meant, but the description could only be Grace's. People who had been part of the Underground Railroad recognized it, Patricia said. They understood what they were seeing, a survivor, documenting her survival, preserving the knowledge that had saved her. Marcus thought about his grandmother's note. Do not discard. She'd known this photograph was important, even if she didn't know the full story. Grace wanted this remembered, he said. Not just by her family, but by everyone. She wanted people to know what she'd survived, what they'd survived together. Patricia nodded, and she wanted to preserve those symbols. By 1892, the Underground Railroad had been over for decades. People who had run it were dying, memories were fading. Grace literally wore the map on her wrist and photographed it. She was creating a historical record. Marcus spent the next month tracing his family line from Grace and Samuel forward to his grandmother. The path was clearer than the backward journey into slavery had been. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, property records, all the documentation that free people could maintain. Grace and Samuel had 4 children, 3 daughters and a son. The son, Thomas, became a carpenter like his father. One daughter, Alice, became a teacher, part of the first generation of Black educators in Charleston's segregated schools. Another daughter, Ruth, followed her mother into dressmaking and eventually ran a successful shop. The youngest daughter, Esther, was Marcus's great-great-grandmother. Patricia helped him trace Esther's line. Born in 1888, she would have been 4 years old when that photograph was taken. She married in 1908, had 5 children during the 1910s and 20s. One of those children was Marcus's great-grandmother. Your grandmother told you Grace was important, Patricia said, but she didn't know the details. That suggests the story got lost somewhere between generations. Marcus found a possible reason in a letter from 1915. Esther, writing to her sister, mentioned, "Mother passed away yesterday. She was 70 years old and lived to see so much. Too much suffering these last years. She asked me before she died to keep the bracelet safe, said it was important, but she was too weak to explain why. I will keep it as she wished." Grace had died before fully passing on the story. The bracelet had been preserved, but its meaning had faded. Marcus found more clues in family documents. The bracelet appeared in probate records when Esther died in 1942, listed among inherited items, passed to Marcus's great-grandmother. Then another mention when she died in 1968, passed to Marcus's grandmother, but no record of the photograph being passed along with it. They had become separated at some point. The bracelet probably seemed like a simple keepsake, Patricia said. Without the context of the photograph showing Grace deliberately wearing it, without the story of what the symbols meant, it was just old jewelry. Marcus made a call to his mother. "Mom, do you remember Grandma ever mentioning an old bracelet? Maybe something from her grandmother?" There was a long pause. There was something. Grandma kept a small box in her dresser. She said it had things from her grandmother and great-grandmother. I looked through it once when I was young. There were some old letters, a prayer book, and I think, yes, there was a bracelet. Very plain, kind of beaten up. I remember thinking it was strange she kept it since it wasn't pretty. Do you know where that box is now? It should still be in her dresser. I haven't gone through her bedroom yet. Marcus drove to his grandmother's house that afternoon. In the top drawer of her dresser, beneath folded handkerchiefs and old gloves, he found a small wooden box. Inside were the letters his mother had mentioned, the prayer book, a few other small items. And there, wrapped in soft cloth, was the bracelet. Marcus's hands trembled as he lifted it. The metal was tarnished, worn smooth in places from being worn for years, but the symbols were still there, tiny engravings, just as they appeared in the photograph. He photographed it immediately and sent the images to Patricia. Her response came within minutes. "Oh my God, it survived. Bring it to the archive tomorrow. We need to document this properly." 3 months later, the Avery Research Center opened a new exhibition, Paths to Freedom: The Journey of Samuel and Grace. The centerpiece was the original 1892 photograph, enlarged and restored, displayed beside the actual bracelet in a climate-controlled case. Patricia and her team had carefully documented every symbol, matching each to known Underground Railroad codes and plotting the complete escape route on an interactive map. But the exhibition told more than just Samuel and Grace's story. It contextualized their journey within the larger history of the Underground Railroad, Reconstruction, and the rise of Jim Crow. It showed how formerly enslaved people built lives and communities, only to face new forms of oppression in the 1890s. Visitors could trace the route Samuel and Grace traveled, see photographs of locations that still existed, read testimonies from other fugitives who had made similar journeys. The exhibition included letters, documents, and artifacts from other families who had preserved their own histories. Marcus stood at the opening ceremony, looking at his ancestor's photograph now hung in a place of honor. Grace's direct gaze at the camera held new meaning for him. She had looked into the future and demanded to be remembered. Dr. Patricia Williams gave a presentation explaining the significance of the discovery. This bracelet represents something unique in Underground Railroad history. While we have documentation of symbols used to guide fugitives, markings on quilts, signs carved into trees, codes and songs, we have very few physical artifacts that actually carried this information. Grace created a wearable, portable map that saved her life and Samuel's. Then she preserved it for 130 years, ensuring her story wouldn't be forgotten. The local news covered the exhibition. Several other families came forward with their own stories, their own artifacts, inspired by Grace's example. The archive began documenting these additional histories, building a more complete picture of Black resistance and resilience in the South. Marcus gave interviews, telling his family's story. He explained how a photograph found in an attic had led to uncovering a history he never knew he had. "My grandmother always said someone needed to find out their story properly," he said. "She knew it was important, even without knowing the details. That knowledge passed down through generations, that these people mattered, that their lives meant something. That's what kept this photograph and bracelet safe for over a century." The exhibition included a section on how families could research their own histories. Patricia created workshops teaching people how to use archives, how to read historical documents, how to piece together stories from fragments. A school group visited, students clustered around the bracelet, marveling at the tiny symbols. Their teacher explained how people had risked everything for freedom, how they had used intelligence, creativity, and courage to survive. Marcus watched a young girl trace the escape route on the interactive map, her finger following the path from Charleston north through South Carolina. She looked up at Grace's photograph, at that direct, unflinching gaze. "She was brave," the girl said. "Yes," Marcus agreed. "She was." The bracelet sat in its case, the symbols still clear after 160 years. Each tiny marking represented a piece of knowledge passed between people who had no power except their intelligence and determination. Information preserved in metal, worn openly as an act of resistance, photographed deliberately so it would never be forgotten. Grace had succeeded. Her story was no longer lost. The route she followed to freedom was now documented, her courage recognized, her refusal to forget honored. The photograph from 1892 hung on the wall, Samuel and Grace, prosperous and dignified, photographed at a moment when their freedom was again under threat. But they had insisted on being documented, on preserving their story, on looking directly into the camera and into the future with determination. That photograph, and the bracelet Grace wore in it, had bridged time. From 1864, when she fled into the night, through 1892, when she sat for a portrait, to today, when her great-great-great-grandson stood in an archive surrounded by people learning her story. The symbols that had guided her to freedom now guided others to understanding. The bracelet that had saved her life now taught new generations about courage, resistance, and the human capacity to overcome. Grace had wanted to be remembered. She had made sure of it. And now, finally, her story was being told properly. Marcus touched the glass case gently, a gesture of connection across the generations. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for not forgetting. Thank you for making sure we would know." The bracelet sat silent, its symbols speaking across time, its message clear. Freedom is precious, history matters, and some stories demand to be preserved, no matter how long it takes for them to be heard.